Well, good morning to you. It is such a wonderful thing to be able to deal with all of the stuff that I'm trying to deal with these days with uh, making this work. It's really good for me because I have to study things that if I knew them, I forgot them. And I'm learning them all over again. And I'm so thrilled in my old age to be learning some things. We're going to talk today about something that's really important, but let me introduce it this way. Our son and his wife and a couple of their family members are here with us, and he was telling me that uh, with our granddaughter who's getting married this summer, he gave them this piece of advice, which I thought was really good. First of all, on your income, set aside 10% of your income for the Lord's work, for your tithe. Set aside 10% for savings. Now, I'd heard those two before, but I'd never heard this one. Set aside the third thing, 10% of your income for vacations. Now, they've had some really good trips as a family and so on. And when he was growing up, we had good family vacations, but nothing as extensive as they've had. And I thought that was really good. He said, so you've got to learn from the get-go when you get married to live on 70% of your money. I'm going to argue for 10% of a church's budget before we get done today. And I hope that it will be of interest to you and of great value to you. So we're going back to the master plan of evangelism, and I'm not leaving the campus today as I did the last couple of weeks. We're going to look at an element that Coleman looks at in the master plan of evangelism. If you've been following along, you know that we're springboarding off of the master plan of evangelism and covering most of what Coleman covers in my own words. But on occasion, I throw something else in. But today we're back on Coleman, and I hadn't really realized by reading the chapter on association that he said as much as he said about this particular topic, which I call the retreats, Layer Week, Jesus and the retreat. In Mark chapter 3, it tells us that Jesus went on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to them, and he appointed 12 to do 3 particular things. And the first thing was to be with him. And that's the key thing about the retreat. So I want to get started on this from a slightly different direction, kind of psychological, that I think is useful. You may not have heard of Dunbar's number, but I am a great fan of this as a concept because it helps me understand how to not get terribly stressed out when you're trying to do ministry. Dunbar has analyzed a lot of different things, and he's not a Christian, but he's analyzed that most humans, this is more of a concept than a number, have 5 people in their life who is their strong support clique, and then a sympathy group who really understand them of 15. But an active network of 50 people who they have fairly regular contact with, and 150 is the capacity to have social relationships with people in your life. And I've come to understand that he's true. Now, he says you can have acquaintances in the outer layers of big numbers, but Dunbar's number, if you just want to Google that, you'll find it, or use AI, you'll find better information on it. Dunbar's number of 150 says you've got 150 slots in your brain for other people. And it's plus or minus, of course, depending on who, but you cannot extend beyond that limit of your particular personality and brain. If you add somebody, somebody will get subtracted from that number. Now, when you consider that you have to have your family in there, and he calculates on average it's 21% of your 30 some odd people in your family, you subtract your work associates and you subtract your neighbors because they're just there, you're left with about 50 slots for your church life. And I think that's really important to understand. Add to that there's another component of things. by Professor Hall, I forget his first name, but he says it takes 50 hours face to face to make a casual friend, and to make a close friend, it's 200 hours. So when people go to church only on Sunday, they only see the Sunday people an hour a week. That would calculate out to 15 years to make a close friend. So when people say, I don't have any friends in my church, you haven't invested the time in the people. So there are several impossibilities when you put these things together. One is that the structural deficiency we have of depending on Sundays is killing us because we don't build relationships, but also the pastor's human. He only has 150 slots in his brain. And if everybody in the church thinks that they should know him, he should know them personally, then a lot of people are going to be disappointed, and he's going to be frustrated because he wants to minister to everybody, but he can't. His brain won't let him do it. And I think Jesus, of course, he understood the human capacity, and that's why he worked with these small numbers. You know that he picked 12, and there was the inner circle of 3, and he also sent out 70. That's pretty much the capacity of the people who could have a two-way relationship with him. You see, you might be in somebody else's 150, but if there's more than those people, they can't be in your 150 if you're going to maintain your relationship with the other people that are necessary in your life, starting with your family. And if the church says, oh, well, you should know my mother and she's in the hospital, and I'm disappointed, we had a discussion 2 years ago and you've totally forgotten about me, you don't even care. The problem is that you may be in their 150, but they can't be in yours. And so a pastor in a big church is isolated from a lot of people who think they know him. And that leads to the possibility of them knowing the persona, the stage presence, but not knowing the individual. Jesus wasn't going to give in to that. So we're going to deal with exactly what was going on. And this is what I'm excited about today, because Coleman brought my attention back to the whole business of the 12. He said he was going to be with them. Who did he say he was going to be with? Well, by extension, of course, he's with all of us in the presence of the Holy Spirit. But physically, he trained up these 12, 11 of them then. And Coleman calculates, and I have to go back after I haven't really verified this, that he has 7 recorded getaways in 3 years with these 12 people. I think that's a real critical understanding, and Coleman outlines some of them, and I think I have an addendum that as I read the chapter on this and reread it, he missed this. Now, his curriculum in raising up his disciples, who was going to train to fish for people, and by the way, there's a quote straight from Coleman's master plan of evangelism. I always want to call it master plan of discipleship. Master plan of evangelism is a quote directly there on the bottom of the screen. It's just a sentence I lifted from his book. So his curriculum was not a school, not a seminary in the formal sense. He said, hey, you guys, you can follow me. I want you to follow me. And so his life was the lesson. And to know was to be with him. See, what we don't have recorded a lot of, and I've mentioned this before, is what happened on the road. Somebody's estimated 3,125 miles Jesus walked. At 3 miles an hour, just call it 3,000 miles. At 3 miles an hour, that's 1,000 hours, over 1,000 hours on the road. What was he doing? Was he by himself? No, he had his 12 with him. And what happens when you walk? You talk. And so his curriculum was this association with them. And I am fond of saying, if you say this is lesson 1, it implies there's going to be lesson 2, 3, 4, 5 that follows. And you've already lost. Because, well, there's nothing particularly wrong with lessons 1, 2 through 13. There's nothing particularly right with it. And when Jesus dealt with the people, he always went with the interruption, and a third of his conversations that he had were interruptions. So he always taught in the moment with the people that were there while his 12 were looking over his shoulder and observing. That's when he said, I'll make you into fishers of men. That was his method. It wasn't face to face completely with individual disciples. It was watch me. Just watch me do what I do. And that was the curriculum. And so Jesus spent much more time with them, not less time, as time went on. We're not sure, but it was at least 6 months from the initial encounters that John talks about with John the Baptist saying, follow him, until the formal recognition of them in Mark chapter 3, where he goes up on the mountainside and he prays and he looks at the crowd that he's gathered, which I'm going to say is 70, don't know, but the crowd, and he picked 12 out of them because he'd been observing them in life, and they had in some ways been observing him. We just do not know if they were with him all the time or they were home and they were with him for a little bit. We don't know. But the time expanded with them as they moved through his ministry, and it grew with the 12 right up to the very end with Judas, and Judas was there. It just is one of the most mind-boggling things that Judas was there and didn't get it. And he's at one point, Jesus illustrates that he knows that one of them's a dropout. And he says one of you is a devil. He doesn't name him in that event, but he recognized that one was going to wipe out. You're always going to have wipeouts. If you're trying to lead in ministry, you're going to have wipeouts, and boy, they hurt. I've had my share of them in life. And there was maybe a phase when I didn't really think about it, but I was so discouraged that maybe I thought, I don't even remember thinking that I'll drop out, but it was pretty close to the edge of that. More time, not less time, as he went along, was a very key thing for us to understand. Now, there are 6 known retreat locations, and they're spread around in different places. Now, Jesus' main base of operations was in Capernaum, and he went this way, that way, and the other way from there, quite some distance. I'll say at least a day's travel to these various places, and taught them different things in different places. You got to figure out what my 10% is. I think a church should set aside as for. Retreat 1 was in Tyre and Sidon. It was far from his home territory. It was not particularly a preaching tour. He stayed there out of sight with people and had private time spent over instead of the public ministry. We tend to think that Jesus' ministry was all public. No, there was private time in there. Retreat 2 is in a different place. I had some maps, but I didn't drop them in here. And you can go look these things up, and I really encourage you to do so, because you can see he was going here, there, and everywhere for these retreats. This particular retreat in the 10 cities, the Decapolis, was where the Gentiles lived. It was a long way from Jerusalem. It was away from all of the cacophony of the religious noises that there would be, and all of the people with religious opinions and so on. And he was there to create space for these disciples to reset their brains and try and get them, as they were watching him and following him, to rethink things. We live in such a noisy world today because we all carry one of these things around with us, and you need to learn to flip it over and put it down. So don't be sitting there trying to talk to somebody unless you're looking something up that's part of the conversation. Don't let that be a distraction to you. We've got all kinds of entertainment devices, and people say I have no time. That's because they're wasting their time doom scrolling through Facebook. I get sick and tired of what I see some pastors putting on Facebook. I look every day just for less than 5 minutes, and I think you should be ashamed of yourself to say some of these things that they're saying in pastors' groups and putting out there in public. You might think it, and you shouldn't even think it, but for goodness sake, why do you put it out there for the world to see? I digress. So Jesus was saying, here, I need to take you apart so that we can kind of hit the reset button and rethink. And I really believe that a lot of what Jesus did was what we would call debriefing. After the feeding of the 4,000, he chose to be with his disciples over being with the crowd. We have a world that loves the big. We have people who love big churches because they think big churches can do more. I'll argue that big churches have a really hard time doing more. Maybe more in quantity, but pound for pound, hour for hour, day for day, year for year, person for person, they have a really, really hard time keeping up with churches that are just more ordinary, just down there around the Dunbar number size. The median-sized church, I was talking with some seminary students, had lunch with them, was it yesterday or the day before, and asked them what they thought the average size church was in North America. And I said, now you got to bear in mind, there's lots of big churches down there in the United States and a few of them in Canada, but there's also a lot of hidden churches. So what do you think the typical size church was? I'd already set them up to think, oh, it's probably smaller than you think. And they said, 150. Well, it's a really interesting question, because when you say, what's the size of the church? Everybody's not there every Sunday. So what's the size of the church? The typical attendance? People attend 2 out of 5 Sundays on average in North America. These days, some less and some more, but that's the middle line. So if they're attending 2 Sundays out of 5, then it's a huge problem, because they're not always there. So what's the size of the church? Well, in general terms, if somebody says, my church is, about 60, they're talking attendance. And that church, I can tell you, is probably closer to 120, plus or minus a little bit there. And because the people who weren't there this Sunday might be there next Sunday. And, if a pastor takes vacation, he's not there all the time either. So it's a perfectly normal thing. And if all we've got is Sunday, then we're in big trouble, because the overlap of the one is 2 out of 5 Sundays here, and the overlap with the other person, it's a very small number of seeing each other. And yet the whole church of that church of 60, which is a typical attendance in North American churches today, half the churches are bigger, half are smaller than that, half are smaller than 60. And yet there's still churches. And another program will probably take a little bunny trail on what actually defines a church. In fact, maybe I'll do that next week. But we have to understand that this noise and everything going everywhere, we need more hours together, and retreats work. So that's what Jesus was doing here, debriefing them. And then there was the time in Caesarea Philippi, the famous one. You should look that up, with the gates of hell. And there's some great videos on that on YouTube. Just look that up. That's where Peter makes his declaration about Jesus, and Jesus says, got it, Peter. Okay, let's move on from here. The retreat was the only classroom that he ever used, it would appear. He did preach in the synagogues, and I'm sure that the disciples went into the synagogues with him. That wasn't a primary thing. He wasn't there every week in one synagogue. You know the story from early on, I hope you do, about him getting to the synagogue in Nazareth and reading the scriptures and from Isaiah, and then sitting down and saying, that's me. Amazing statement. But that was a one-off. Many things were one-off, but his disciples with him all the time outside of the meeting. You see, if you have a church meeting, let's say the traditional time is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and it goes till 12 o'clock, or maybe the long-winded preacher a little later, whatever it is. You call that church, but no, church is really what happens from 12 o'clock all the way through the week, back to 11 o'clock the next Sunday morning when you have your team meeting. And it's a backstage meeting primarily, and others are invited in. I hope that you make your church meetings accessible verbally and in tone and in everything you do, to have people come and visit. Paul talks about visitors coming in and getting the message straight. We don't want them to get confused. So it's a public meeting, but it really is a backstage meeting. The actual show, the theater is from when that meeting ends, when people get out of the dressing room and onto the field and play the game. That wasn't on this slide. How did I get to that? He goes to another area, Perea. It's the other side of Jordan, and spends a fair bit of time there, apparently, and had extended time for deep teaching again, using some of the public events, the parables and healing, and some personal instruction, but it was the time of the retreat that was the most productive in what he was doing with the 12. That's the main point I want to get through to you. That's a terrible way to say it. Get through to you as if you're hard-headed people. You're not, I know that. You're trying to learn. But you want to come back and pay attention and quit doom scrolling over there on Instagram. Yes, I know the TikTok video is funny. And I know the animations they're doing are really quite entertaining. And it's nice to have a little endorphin release in your brain, some ha-ha moments. But this is really, really critical to your life. When he took him to Ephraim, he had like a setup, pause retreat. And he stayed there with them and preparing them for what was about to come. And then the road to Jerusalem. He took the 12 aside and he talked to them. And we've got private events and public events going on here. Right up until the very end, and the intensity of the teaching that we have, nearly half of all the Gospels is focused in on that last week of Jesus' life as the intensity grows and grows and grows. But there's something else it's just a little phrase that sticks out from John chapter 18. Where Jesus left with his disciples to cross over the valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. And on the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. The key thing is Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. We don't have all of the recordings of those meetings when he met there with his disciples, out of sight of the main crowd, with this key group that he was mentoring. Often he met there. And so we know then if it's often, it's more than the 7 that we can actually identify as retreat times. And I think that that's something that where churches fail, where pastors fail, they fail to recognize, they're the pastor of all the people, and there's a sense in which that's true. But they fail to recognize they need to have these key people they're working with in a core group, I guess would be the term we might use, and meet with them independently, out of sight, out of mind, often with the people, and not necessarily with a prepared PowerPoint presentation or an agenda, because Jesus would appear to have always been with them and just kind of, we would say, kind of chewing the fat. And those 2 hours of chewing the fat in the valley, well, they're, I don't know, they're chewing on some dates or whatever. And we don't know the questions asked or the things that Jesus said, maybe the jokes that they shared with one another. Jesus, after all, was very human. Maybe they played some games out there. I suspect they did. They just did life together, apart from their families, apart from all the other people in the church. And I think retreats teach us that that's important. And I'm going to argue that it makes a lot of sense for a church to budget in 10% of their budget for retreats. I'm going to argue that 1 retreat a year, a board retreat for planning, is not the only thing that's needed. It's not a bad thing. I'm all for that. But, without an agenda, just going to be with one another and, pulling up a chair in front of the campfire and sitting there kind of dozing off with the mosquitoes buzzing around and the smoke getting in your eyes and just sharing life in the summertime, or perhaps in a retreat center where it's the winter time and you're there with the snow outside and you sit by the fire and you just relax. And some people talk and some people listen, but you let the conversation go where it goes and you be the example. remember talking with a deacon who's now with the Lord, who said that he had had a pastor who, like him, was a hunter and a fisher and so on. He said, we spent almost all of our time talking about the new tires on the 4x4 than we ever spent about the things of the Lord. And he longed for that conversation. And, to the pastor, it's kind of just talking shop. And he thinks, oh, I don't want to talk about it. I just want to talk about whatever, your new rifle. To the other guy, well, you need to talk about the new rifle if the guy's interested. But you need to demonstrate that what is your heartbeat, what stirs you, it just has to ooze out of you that you care about the things of the Lord and about the people that are there in the church, and how you wish in a part of you that you could minister to more of them. But you teach them about Dunbar's number and say, I can't. You're one of my inner guys, and I got to count on you to go and reach the others. That's what retreats teach us. It's important for us to understand them. These are the points that Coleman makes about retreats. He said that they were very deliberate, they weren't accidental. They were led by Jesus, because he was the leader and they were the follower, and that taught them how to lead. And so follow me, and I'll teach you how to do the work. So he took the initiative, and those retreat times seem to have intensified near the end, and the distance from the crowds created the depth of conversation that they were having. And come back to what we said earlier, and Coleman makes this point strongly. His life was the curriculum. It wasn't in a book. He wasn't arguing against scrolls, but he was just there with the people. And if you need to have a PowerPoint presentation to teach what's going on, you're in trouble. You may have to start there. And I'm using PowerPoint right now to keep me going, but you can tell I'm just ranting. I'm not working from notes. There's no evidence that Jesus worked from notes. And if Jesus didn't work from notes, there's no evidence that Peter got up on the day of Pentecost and said, oh, here, let me get my iPad, and here's my notes, point number 1. No, he was shooting from the hip, because his hips were full. His heart was full. His head was full. He had been with Jesus. And they were not ordinary people anymore, because the others took note that they had been with Jesus. And it's got to be, I know that all of us are so far behind what he was. I'm not trying to argue that we're Jesus, but we've got to be mini Jesuses that others will see and will say, I catch the vibes. I want to be like that. These young seminarians we were with the other day, Scott and I could see in their eyes that they're trying to figure it all out. And yeah, we had to pay for the lunch. It was several $100s, but so what? This is memorable. I said to them, 3 weeks from now, you're not going to remember any sermons you heard, but you are going to remember that we had lunch together. And it's the retreats that people remember. So it would make sense to me that you, as a local church, you be exemplary to others. You set aside a portion, 10, I would hope 15% of your money for missionary endeavors from which you can gain nothing directly. The money that goes to the local food bank has the possibility of giving you some payback in some way with people and so on. And that's good money too. But I'm talking about money that you just throw away to help somebody else plant another church, and you don't put demands on them. You encourage them. If you're the pastor of the church, you take them into your 150, really 50 people, 1 or 2 or 3 other missionaries, and you communicate with them regularly, because that's a really good thing to do. But in addition to that, set aside some money, not to just pay off the mortgage, but some money so that you can gather together in a retreat. I've lost my place there. So here's the questions for you as we draw it to a close. Who do you take away with you? You got somebody who you take under your wing, as the phrase goes? I think it's best if that person that you take under your wing is maybe 10, 15 years younger than you. And even when you're new into the ministry in your 20s, you can still take a teenager along, somebody who's showing some goods and, just drive when you go to Costco. Say, hey, come on, let's go to the store. And just do it. And then talk about, you can talk about the sports, and you can talk about the entertainment, you can talk about school, but talk about the things of the Lord as the subjects come up, and get good at I was going to say pivoting, but that sounds like a right turn. Just enfolding into the conversation naturally the things that really stir your heart, and see the openings that are there, and talk with people. Who do you take with you? I always feel badly when I'm in the car by myself and I don't have somebody with me, because that travel time is precious, precious time that can be used. Yeah, I'll listen to a podcast and sometimes some music and maybe some news, but when I'm by myself, but I'd far rather be with somebody. You don't have to talk all the time. Just be with them and create that getaway time. It's very important for the life of your church, your ministry. Do you think that the training happens in class? Well, there's nothing particularly wrong with classes. I'm not trying to shut that idea down. But the training is in life, much more outside of the class. My perception when I went to Bible school was I learned a lot from my professors, and I really had some people that I counted on as professors taught me an awful lot that's pointed me in I think, the right direction. I used to say 85% of what I learned outside of class. I learned in the dorm. I learned as we were just doing some fun and some things. I learned what the other people were like. And some of those people that I went to Bible college with way back in the 1960s are still my friends today. And even though we both got old, we're still the same people, just an older version of the same. And it's a wonderful thing to do. Build those relationships with the time, doing things with people in life. And let people get to know you, who you really are. Well, you want to confess your faults to one another, not necessarily the incidents or the sins, but maybe the tendencies, the things that you struggle with. And your friends can help you, and you can make a difference. We've got to do better going forward than we've done in the past, and I hope this will help you to do so. Get a hold of Coleman's book. You can get a used copy or a cheap copy, an ebook copy. It's still copywritten and out there, so I can't give you one. I can give you one for the training on the 12, but I can't give you one on Coleman's book because it's still under copyright until 70 years after Coleman dies. And I'm not going to be here because he's not dead yet. But the concepts, he would love to know that we're talking about these concepts and spreading them today. I never met the man. He's made a big difference to me, and I hope that by God's grace, I can make a difference to you. Well, there we go. That's it for today. I'll see you next week, and bring somebody else along. You gotta smash that subscribe button. That's the cool way to say it. Come back, go back, look. We're at number 62. There's lots of lessons, and most of them are kind of rants like this, semi-prepared. I think they're all rants like this, semi-prepared. Not all the sentences are clearly constructed. There's a lot of ums and ahs in there, but you got the best I've got. And I hope that it'll be some of the best for you as well. See you next time. God bless you.